Hello. So this is the feedback on the poetry side of the PC2 December mock exam. So watch this closely, maybe a couple of times, and take loads of notes about what you can learn from it. So hopefully this looks familiar to you. Your question was, explore the view that in the poems, in the comedy anthology poetry, men are presented as weak and idiotic. You must refer to Tam O'Shanter and one other poem. In your answer, you need to analyse closely the poet's authorial methods and include comment on the extract below, although I haven't bothered copying and pasting that here. 25 marks, 40 minutes. Just one thing about the wording of our question that seemed to cause a tiny bit of problem was I don't think people could see that the italics meant that comedy anthology poetry is the title of the text. So we got a lot of odd use of the phrase poetry men instead of just men in answers. So we can see where it's come from, but you kind of have to know that that's a really odd expression to use. Yeah, people just couldn't see the italics, I think. So here's a kind of breakdown of the title. Hopefully you've kind of got your head around this idea of content and debate over the last term, but it's a way of looking at any essay title where you identify the content, i.e. what you have to cover to be relevant, and the debate, i.e. what you are supposed to have an opinion on. So here the content is really just the word men, although you might, you probably should interpret that as male characters for accuracy. So the men in the text, you've got to identify your male character, you've got to identify the ways in which they are presented, which might include voice, setting, structure, but you also need to think about literally what they do, so the kind of action, the events, what happens to them. And even though men is in the plural, most of the poems only have one kind of significant male character. So like one male character per poem is enough. You don't have to generalize beyond that, although also you can write about, a single male character as a representative of men. But just at the note in pink there, so there was some focus on women. And even though opposites can be really helpful in terms of interpreting titles, that's probably more at the debate side than the content side. So separate focus on female characters is really tangential. If it's in Tam O'Shanter suddenly writing a paragraph about Kate or Nanny. That's not what the question's asking for. Whilst doing that, there's a good chance that you will accidentally say some promising, decent things by accident, but it's the focusing on the women separately that fundamentally isn't what's being asked for. So a really good lesson to learn about content is if you can identify the content of a statement, then you can make sure that your essay is 100% relevant and not risk any sections being sort of off topic. And then those words weak and idiotic are your debate. So you need to explore why their behavior might fit these labels or interesting exceptions. You might need to consider you need to consider ultimately whether these weaknesses and follies are criticised, condemned, accepted, or celebrated, and to what purpose. Now, the wording of the question doesn't explicitly ask you to do that, but that's what we mean by explore the view, and that's what you're going to need to make your argument that bit more developed or thoughtful. Quite a big problem that came up in both Tam O'Shanter and a lot of the chosen poems is some confusion between like morality and intelligence. You can't just sort of say that things that are morally bad are stupid. I mean, there's probably a philosophical school of thought that would say that, but there was too much of if you don't like what Tam does, or you don't like the satirical the elegy general's kind of corruptness, you can't just label that as stupid or weak. You can there are ways of arguing. You can talk about someone being morally weak in their lack of self-control. That makes it much more precise and credible. But you can't just conflate evil and stupidity as the same thing, because yeah, they're not the same thing. Just something doesn't have to be right or what you agree with for it to be intelligent or strong, unfortunately. So that led to like quite simplistic sort of judgments in quite a few of the poetry answers. So I put this in like a charming gold color because this is some of the big achievements. So these are the things that we can really say that almost everyone has done well. Almost every essay that I read for poetry had a clear introduction. People were really good at identifying their viewpoint, even if that viewpoint wasn't necessarily a great argument. There was a little bit of clarity and a sense of people just identifying their two poems really straight away. I don't think I read any examples of the wrong poet or the wrong title, like those kind of basics were all covered. Almost every essay prioritized Tam O'Shanter. People understood that, if you're going to have an imbalance, better to say more about the given poem than the chosen one. And almost every essay chose one other poem to go with it, mostly sensibly. There didn't seem to be anyone going madly trying to cover 5 or 6 or anything kind of wild like that. And most people, I think, also made good use of the given extract. You had like one kind of lengthy stanza of Tam O'Shanter to use, and that gave a lot of people a grounding in textual detail. If there's no clear textual detail, you really can't get past band 2, because that's what generalized means. You've got to have some textual detail to get into band 3, which is 11 plus, and then to get 16 plus, you've got to have a really rich, convincing level of detail. And again, almost every essay seemed to identify reasonable examples of what might constitute weakness or idiocy. So there are some big successes in what people have managed to cover. But there are also problems. So if we start with Tam O'Shanter, the biggest problem is in a lot of students' grasp of it. It is fundamentally a playful celebration of drinking culture. It is not the stark moral warning it pretends to be. That is the joke, the irony of the poem. I would say the large proportion of students either do not understand that, do not want to understand that, have forgotten that, or I don't know, just really want to agree with the statement. But take it seriously, and you can't get past straightforward. To say that this poem is ridiculing drunken men, to say this poem is attacking or criticizing Tam, any of those viewpoints are fundamentally straightforward or even simplistic. So they are really capping where you can go. So here's some other ways in which you can make it better. You've got to comment on the use of the speaker, the irony of that voice, especially their use of the pronoun we early on, I think is really essential. And then that might link to settings, the setting of the pub, the settings around the journey, the settings of the church. How do they influence our kind of experience of Tam's weak or idiotic behaviour? And then, this is probably inevitable, but a lot of answers over-relied on the passage we gave to the extent where it's really obvious that they just didn't know any detail beyond that. We're trying to help you out with that passage, but you've got to give a bit more. And it is good to take the poem chronologically, but you've got to avoid just telling us the story. That's a really easy trap for people to fall into with Tam. Make sure that you're leading with opinions, relevant, question-focused opinions. And then I think I've already covered this in the previous slide, but lengthy writing about the women as separate from Tam, it just started to lead to irrelevance and potentially drag things towards the bottom band. Okay, in theory, you could do any poem, but basically the ones in green are the better choices. I suppose really just that because they are easier, and this is a kind of case of where sometimes doing the obvious thing might be better, but Mrs. Sisyphus is probably the best choice. It has a really specific male character who is derided as stupid, as unproductive, as wasteful, or, obsessive, and there's so much focus on him from that speaker's perspective. There's also the comparison to what he's meant to be in the original myth. So Mrs. Sisyphus works really well. Not My Best Side, again, does work really well. It's the idea that the knight's meant to be particularly brave, strong, heroic, and there's a sort of playful challenge to that. You've got to do it in a nuanced way. You've got to sort of see that he's still the winner, like he's still the dominant figure in the poem, and he gets the girl and blah, 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 but he is laughed at, he's mocked, and he's undermined. So there's a lot that you can say in response to this question. The flea does work, but it is probably it's a bit of a simplistic view of the flea to just say that the speaker is just really stupid and his argument's rubbish. It's hard to make it go very far or make it very sophisticated, but it's definitely relevant, and quite a lot of people did choose it. Sunniprostatin can work, but it's quite thin ice. The main issue is that the male figures just aren't really there. You've got very little to work with. There is some interesting stuff that you can say about masculinity and kind of toxic masculinity in the poem, but you just don't really have like a clear enough male character to comment on, I think. And then satirical elegy, you do have this figure of the general, but it doesn't really address or explore that his problems are to do with maleness. So it's not as there's not as much to work with as there is in some of the other poems I've suggested. And also it's that moral issue of like, well, is he weak and stupid, or is he, like, he's awful, he's corrupt, he's selfish, he's awful, but like, is that the same as weak and stupid? There are a couple of good points to be made about him dying in his bed and not being a brave warrior, but it's not as good. It's just not as good an answer as the ones on the green side. And then Marvel's House, I don't know if anyone did do this, I haven't read any, but the man is just not there. There's just not enough to work with to make Marvel's House kind of relevant on this one. So just flagging up, this is the list of advice that'll be the main source of feedback for you on your essay. Will be circling some of these numbers. I'm going to talk them through really quickly because this video is already longer than I want it to be. The ones that I think I may need to explain the most are 9. Like 9 might be, you might have done a lot of things well, but you might be very stuck at, well, the character does this, the character does this, the character is bad, the character is good. You need to make sure you are centering the poet and really writing about their choices and what they've prioritized and what they seem to be suggesting. That's so essential in this whole course. And then 11, I think, just goes back to the earlier comments on, just simplistic, the men are stupid, the men are stupid. Not really thinking, well, the men are stupid, but they're allowed to be. The men are stupid, but it's celebrated. The men are stupid, but, they're not really criticized. You've got to find a bit more of an interesting perspective, ultimately. And then loads of people will have 13 circled because you had to write about Tam, and people have written about it to various degrees of detail, but almost everyone will have 13 circled because you need to know it really well to get up to the top marks on this essay. Okay, last thing then. Here's a list of problems and here's a list of potential solutions. So problem 1, poor sentencing, misusing or inventing words. There's a lot of this, a lot of really imprecise, odd use of words, or a lot of the main made-up word that I kept reading was like idiocracy, which is an amazing made-up word. It would suggest like a ruling elite comprised of idiots, but I think most people used it when they meant idiocy. So it's just a kind of laziness or clumsiness. But the solution is to just read and write more. If you aren't very good at your use of the English language, then you aren't doing it enough. You aren't experiencing it. You haven't read as much or written as much as you could or should have. Similarly to handwriting, timing, speed, the only solution is constant time practice. You cannot just expect yourself to walk into an exam and be able to write loads in 40 minutes if you've never done that before. There are many obvious metaphors or parallels to that, like running a mile, entering a competition, baking a cake. If you don't practice those things, you can't do them. 3, this is really specific, but there were a few people who just cannot integrate quotes and sentences. They just clump them there as a little list. There's a link on the slide to a really specific resource on SharePoint that shows you exactly how to do that. And just generally reading model answers. 4, knowledge of time. The only answer to that is reading and watching Tam repeatedly. There is so much resource on Tam O'Shanter that we've given you that you have no excuse not to know it by summer. 5, focusing on the question. The answer to that is probably spending more time looking at questions and doing planning. Maybe it's really kind of getting your head around the ideas of content and debate, which are explained earlier in this video. 6, you've got to move beyond the straightforward, and I know how passive aggressive this sounds, but the answer is to literally listen to your teacher. If you had written the things that you were told to write about Tam O'Shanter, your answer would not be straightforward. There is no content in this feedback that isn't something we've covered as a team, that's covered in our resources in detail. So like, honestly, just listen to your teacher and you'll move beyond straightforward. The other way is to think about the concept of yes, but. Most titles are easy enough to agree with, but you've got to spot the problem, you've got to spot the exception, if there is one. This isn't quite true of the Kite Runner question, but I'll leave that to Georgina's video. 7, choosing a poem. You've got to know the collection well enough and also know the spec, by which I mean the list, the aspects of comedy list. You all kind of engaged with like an A3 grid of this just late in your revision stages. So, you really need to go back to that and just know how to make a really good, sensible choice. And then lastly, number 8, can you actually center the author in your analysis and your argument? Well, that there isn't an easy answer for, because it is something that requires an intellectual breakthrough. If you are a passive recipient of art forms, if you're someone who has never watched a movie and wondered why they cast that actor, like you can't tell the difference between actors and characters, or you don't wonder why they ended it that way or why they put that scene there, or you've never listened to a song and thought, oh, that's an odd place for them to have the chorus repeat. If you just accept things as they are, as if God created them and there are no human interventions, you can't do this and you'll never really develop your arguments. So it has to happen, and you'll have that moment of epiphany somewhere down the line maybe, but we can't control whether it happens when you're 17 or when you're sort of 38. But best of luck with it.